But like, what's your opinion on, the other people in the space and having raised, almost $1 billion and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a tough competitor, right? Because they have such a large war chest. I mean, speaking of Hopin in particular, um, but I've kind of seen this story play out many times. There's like a new market. There's a lot of people that get funding, and the interesting thing is the first mover or the first company that receives a lion's share of the funding isn't always the winner, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. My cousin is the co-founder and CEO of Caviar. So back in the early days of food delivery, you had Caviar, DoorDash, you had Uber Eats, you had Postmates. And it turns out that DoorDash, who was the last mover in that space, they ended up winning, right? They just IPO'd at a huge amount. Back in those days, I think Caviar and Postmates, Uber Eats, they were getting the lion's share of the investment, and people kind of forgot about them, right? But I think what they did really well was that they focused, they executed really rapidly on their strategy, and they eventually won out. You mentioned DraftKings. That's another good example, right? They were actually pretty late to the game. I think they started maybe 4 or 5 years after FanDuel, who sort of invented that daily fantasy space. But they just executed better, and ultimately they were able to win out, right? So
Right.
I think in terms of virtual events, we're still in the early days of the race. Hopin is a very formidable competitor, but at the same time, I think it's going to be a while for us to see how the market sort of shakes out, right? It's a completely
Yeah.
new market, completely new space, and the first mover doesn't always win.
And so, like, what is your opinion on, you know, taking risk that extreme? Do you think that it's ever worth it? Are you doing it now versus, kind of taking a more reasonable approach, so to speak?
Oh man, I could talk about this for a long time. I've thought about this for quite a while actually. Um, I know people that are extremely successful at startups that are billionaires. I know people that have had moderate successes. I've been in startups for the last decade, so I've met quite a lot of people. And I think one of the things that maybe the general public isn't that aware of is a lot of folks that are billionaires that make it really big actually had minor successes before or have come from families that are actually quite well off, right? So you have a good launching pad where you can afford to take more risk. Now, if you're, somebody that comes from absolutely nothing, it's really tough to take that type of financial risk that can have those sort of outsized returns. Um, so I think it's really dependent on your life situation. Like for me, I didn't have that I didn't have that trust fund, or I didn't have that background of having another exit to kind of lean back on. So I wasn't really able to make that type of risky move at that point in my life. Now that I have an exit under my belt, I'm not like set for life or anything, but I'm doing okay. I can afford to take more risk with my next move, right? So I think it's very life dependent. But I do agree in general that if the bigger risk that you take, the more reward there could potentially be for sure.
Do you think that entrepreneurialism is a genetic thing, or do you think it's learned? Do you think that it's common in your family because you did it, or someone before you did it? How do you think that actually happens?
That's a good question. I don't think it's genetic, but I do think that who you hang around with influences your decision whether or not to become an entrepreneur, right? For me personally, when I first started, I was in Silicon Valley, first of all. So there was just a lot of people that wanted to do startups. It was seen as a normal thing. Whereas if you look at, say, Columbus, Ohio, which is where I grew up, right, that wasn't really that common. So I guess the social consequences of quitting a well-paying, stable job and doing your own company was just a lot less in Silicon Valley. And that's changing now, which is great, right? Because now, especially with COVID, you have companies springing up everywhere, not just in tech hubs like Silicon Valley or New York. And I think long term, that's great for entrepreneurship. That's great for diversity, right? You don't have to necessarily move to one area of the country. to do a startup. But I think it is largely dependent on the the people that you hang around, and your family, right? And just the culture that that you grow up in.